Hey class. So this week we're talking about a couple of different things. Something that we all experience, like most of the things we talk about in sociology. We have some experience in the real world about these things. So this week we're talking about gender. We'll talk a little bit about age and health, but we're going to save most of that for next week. So what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Of course, we know the general idea of what it is to be a man, of course. You have to be as strong as a coursing river. You have to have all the force of a great typhoon, um, all the strength of a raging fire. And of course, don't forget this part. You have to be as mysterious as the dark side of the moon. Right. So let's get down to business to discuss sociology and gender. And if for those of you who don't know the reference of what I'm talking about, that's from the movie Mulan. Of course, the animated version from a few years ago. Um, and the movie is a great illustration for what we're talking about here, because Mulan is living in this world where there's very, very strict gender roles. The women are supposed to have respect for their fathers and be obedient and look for a husband, and the men are supposed to go off to war and be the head of the household and things like that. There's a saying in both Chinese and Korean cultures, and perhaps some others, that there are three men that each woman should obey in her life: her father, her husband, and her son. And so, is very, very strict structures on what is expected of each person in their certain roles. So here in the West, we have differing roles. We have different expectations, and these change from generation to generation too. So it's interesting to study this and study our parents' generation, grandparents, and things like that. Back through the decades and the centuries. So let's step into this just a little bit and talk about some of the different things. So gender roles are certainly affected by our opportunities and by our expectations of what we're supposed to be doing in society. What is right for a man to do? What is it right for a woman to do? And so a lot of this is based on our socialization, which this harkens back to several weeks ago. This is like week 2, week 3, when we first started talking about socialization, is just the unspoken expectations of society. And so, we're going through our lives affected by all of this. And we have our parents' expectations, we have our siblings, our friends, we have society at large that we are living up to their expectations or actively and consciously rebelling against them. But still, you're within that context of your own socialization. So think about the expectations that your family has for you, or your job, or classmates, or things like that. And all of those go into shaping us as individuals and how we see ourselves and how we see our roles. This will click. There it goes. So for the sociologists, what does it mean when sociologists talk about these things? Generally, they're talking about behavior and psychological traits. And we basically just talk about, oops, go back, yes, I can go back. Generally, we talk as sociologists as what are the expectations, or we look at the three main theories of functionalism, conflict, and social interaction theory on what these different behavioral and psychological traits mean. So that's basically what we're after here. Generally not making judgment calls and saying, this culture is better than that culture, or this is what's truly manly and that's what's truly manly. Think back a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how to be an adult in societies. And of course, we saw, the Spartans was one of our readings. And no one here that I know of is being sent out into the woods at 13 years old with a blanket and a spear and have to stay out there for a month. And if you come back earlier, then you're not a man. We don't do that here. So we have different expectations, different traits, and things like that. And the sociologist looks at these different expectations, these different things, and say, okay, how do these things function in society? What is this symbol? What does this represent? So that's basically what we want to explore here. I'm trying to click this thing again. It never wants to click. There we go. So is it the same in all societies? Like I was just saying, no, it is not the same in all societies. It's very different. There are some African tribes where the men will wear makeup in these big dances to try and attract mates. Some cultures allow for multiple wives. You can think of all kinds of different examples. I had some Iranian friends, and the men would hold hands in public. They even talked about kissing, and this was when I was in the United Kingdom. And one of the guys, his name was Safa, and he was like, "Yeah, Hamid, he always, in Iran, we could hold hands in public, and that's just a sign of affection and friendship. And you could even kiss a man, and that's a sign of friendship. But here in Wales, we don't do that because people think of different things about it." So it was a different kind of socialization. They'd gone from one culture to a completely different culture, and the different expectations of those cultures. So the characteristics of not just gender roles, but societal expectations in general, public affection, whatever else, are different from cultures. So what are gender roles? Gender roles are what we expect of people. Do we expect men to be aggressive, to be manly, whatever that means? Of course, that has changed over the decades in our own culture and changes from culture to culture. So what do we expect of men? Generally, we expect men to be, the financially stable provider, the protector, the more aggressive person. What do we expect of women? We expect women to be nurturing and caring and good mothers and things like that. So, but we also see this shift in our society for more assertive women in leadership roles and having careers and choosing careers over family, like having a family or having children and things like that. And seeing this promoted and celebrated in some sectors of society. So we see that changing before our very eyes. So the expectations of my generation and of your generation could possibly be different. So again, what are the sociologists concerned about? About the cultural values. We are comparing, contrasting, and seeing how these things fit together. What does gender identity do for the functioning of society? We have certain things that must be done. Someone must earn a living. Someone must bring home the bacon, whether literal or figurative. And who's better suited for the task? We see in more traditional societies, women are at home with children, raising the children, and so men were more likely to go out. And so, we see that change now with our affluence, with delayed childbearing, or choosing not to have children with modern birth control and things like that. So as those things change, our cultural values change, the function of our roles change. Not many people have to think about being warriors and being raided by the next village over or something like that. You guys over in Gastonia aren't worried about people in Kings Mountain coming and raiding your cows or something. So we've got all these different traits that we can think about and think about. Okay, well, is this left over from a previous iteration of our society? Is this something that helps our society function now, and whatever? And so basically, the sociologist is going to point these things out and say, oh yeah, this might be connected to this or that might be connected to that. That's basically what they're going to do. I'm not going to talk about these. I want you guys to read this on your own. Margaret Mead was an anthropologist. She studied these different societies in New Guinea who are very different from our own. So I want you to read through this yourself and look through them. What I do want to talk about, though, is the three theories. So basically, we've kind of covered functionalism already. So functionalism is going to talk about how societies function together. How do these roles help the society function? So you will see someone has to bring home the bacon again. That is a function of society. Someone has to be the provider. Someone has to be the nurturer. Someone has to raise children. If nobody's having children, we're going to go the way of the Shakers and cease to exist because you have to have children to perpetuate your society. So functionalism is going to look at these different roles and these different things that must be filled, how they interact with each other, how they function as a whole, as a society. Symbolic interactionism is the more smaller theory. It's the micro theory, whereas conflict theory and functionalism are the macro theories. They look at the broad, big picture. Symbolic interactionism is the smaller theory that looks at the individual interactions. So they're going to look at the way people are going to interact with each other. So how does a man interact with another man? How does a man interact with children? How does a woman interact with children? How does a man interact with women, women with men, et cetera, et cetera? Think about that. Think about our societal expectations, and think about how many women teachers you had in elementary school. It was probably all of them. There are very few men who go into that field. And that's part of our societal expectations. Perhaps some of it is just men are wired differently and not as nurturing as women and don't want to be around a bunch of screaming 5-year-olds. I don't know. I probably couldn't do it myself. But think about that with symbolic interactionism. They're going to look at those kinds of interactions and kind of study them. What do they signify? Why do people do the things that they do? So again, it goes back to the cultural conditioning and the expectations of the culture. Now, I saved conflict theory for last because it's the big wet blanket of the theories. And those of you who remember way back to our first couple of weeks when we really hit the theories hard, conflict theory is the one that sees everything as a series of conflicts between the haves and the have-nots, and that everything can be portrayed and viewed through this lens of power. So that's what it's mainly concerned with. So they're going to view gender roles as, one, probably the patriarchy, men or whatever, as keeping down women, and that women have a subservient role in society. And so conflict theory would mainly talk about it in terms like that women don't have power and that men have power and exercise that power over them. And this is all based on Karl Marx's theories that were taken instead of economics like Marx was originally writing on. They've taken it into new territories of sociology, of psychology, whatever else, politics, you name it. So yeah, while the other two theories are like, oh, this sounds really interesting. Conflict theory is like, oh, there's terrible things going on. Everything's about power. And there, I don't want to completely dismiss it. There are certain things that are true about it. And women oftentimes in history have been second-class citizens. But I don't think we can look at everything as a series of power plays. I don't think everything can be looked at through that lens. So we need to take a kind of an eclectic view. We need to look at the functionalists, we need to look at the symbolic interactionism, and we need to look at conflict theory. And then take all of those and synthesize it, if I can say that word correctly, into a whole. And so that's what we should do here when we look at these different things. Look at it from each one of these perspectives, and then try to think, what actually corresponds to reality. And so that's kind of your task for this week. Look at the PowerPoint, do the readings, and look at our roles and our socialization and expectations of these roles through all of these theories, and see what you think. What do you think corresponds to reality? What do you think is truly the case?